You're tuned in to 22 Crime, where the truth hides in the details. Together we dive into the darkest corners of human nature, exploring the mysteries that have left investigators puzzled and families searching for justice. Because in the world of crime, the truth is never as simple as it seems. The tragic story of Vanessa Guillen. Vanessa was a 20-year-old Army soldier, full of life and dreams, stationed at the Fort Hood military base in Texas. But on April 22, 2020, Vanessa vanished while on duty, and what followed would shock not just her family but the entire nation. Her disappearance exposed deep, systemic issues within the military, bringing to light the dangers that women in uniform face, both from their peers and the institution that is supposed to protect them. For months, her family fought tirelessly to find out what happened to their daughter and sister, demanding answers from a military that seemed reluctant to investigate. When the truth was finally revealed, it was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The clock is ticking. Let's uncover the truth behind today's mystery. Viewer discretion is advised. 22 is a true crime podcast that delves into real-life crime stories, which often involve graphic descriptions, sensitive content, and strong language that may not be suitable for all audiences. We strive to present these cases with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Please note that the content discussed may be distressing or triggering for some listeners. Additionally, all resources and information presented in this podcast are obtained from publicly available internet sources. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and we recommend that only mature audiences proceed with caution. If you are sensitive to such content, please consider watching another video. Stay safe and take care of your mental health. Before we plunge into the tragic events that led to Vanessa Guillen's disappearance, we must first understand who she truly was. Because Vanessa was not just a name on the headlines. She was a vibrant young woman, full of dreams, hopes, and an unwavering love for her country and her family. Born on September 30, 1999, to Rogelio and Gloria Guillen, Mexican immigrants who settled in Houston, Texas, Vanessa was one of 6 children. Her upbringing was filled with love, laughter, and a strong sense of unity. Family wasn't just important to Vanessa, it was everything. Growing up, her parents instilled in her values that would shape her character: hard work, sacrifice, and a deep appreciation for the opportunities their journey to America had afforded them. But there was something special about Vanessa. From an early age, her passion for serving her country was fierce and unshakable. This wasn't a passing thought, but a dream that fueled her every move. Her family and friends remember Vanessa as a force of nature, someone whose energy could electrify a room. Her laugh was contagious, and her personality impossible to ignore. She had a warmth that drew people in, but she was also fiercely driven. Whether it was academics or athletics, Vanessa wasn't just participating, she was excelling. She loved sports, especially soccer and running. Vanessa didn't just compete, she pushed herself beyond the limits. She'd run marathons through her neighborhood, challenging herself to be better every day. Her sister would later recall how Vanessa would train with her siblings or even her fiancé, sometimes doing squats with them perched on her shoulders. Nothing was too difficult for her. She had a fire, a drive to be the best, not for herself, but to make her family proud. But her talents weren't confined to sports alone. Vanessa was a star in the classroom, too. At Cesar E. Chavez High School, she ranked in the top 15% of her class in 2018, balancing both academic and athletic achievements. But unlike many of her peers, Vanessa's dreams weren't rooted in college life. No, she had something much bigger in mind. From a young age, she knew she wanted to join the United States Army. She saw it not only as a career, but as her calling, a way to protect the country her family had sacrificed so much to call home. In June 2018, Vanessa made that dream a reality. She enlisted in the U.S. Army, filling her family with immense pride, even as they harbored natural worries. The first time they saw her in uniform, the sight was almost surreal. Vanessa, their bright and determined daughter, standing tall, wearing her dream. When Vanessa Guillen first arrived at Fort Hood, she was stepping into a new chapter, one she had dreamed about her entire life. Enlisting in the U.S. Army wasn't just a career for Vanessa, it was her way of giving back to the country that had given her family so much. The pride she felt as a soldier was palpable. Her family could see it, her friends could feel it. She was finally living her dream. At first, life at Fort Hood lived up to her expectations. Stationed at the largest military base in the United States, Vanessa felt like she was part of something monumental. It was a massive post with thousands of soldiers, a place where you could feel the pulse of America's military power. Fort Hood was only a 3-hour drive from her family in Houston, meaning Vanessa could visit often. In the beginning, she did. The joy in her voice when she came home after basic training was unforgettable. She glowed with pride, wearing the uniform she had worked so hard to earn. Her role at Fort Hood, working as a 91F Small Arms and Artillery repairer, gave her a sense of purpose. This job required precision, focus, and discipline, all of which Vanessa had in spades. She thrived on the challenges. Her family, especially her mother Gloria, could see just how proud Vanessa was to serve her country. For a while, everything seemed perfect. But beneath the surface, something much darker was beginning to stir. As the months passed, the joy and excitement that had defined Vanessa's early days at Fort Hood began to fade. The vibrant young woman, so full of energy and optimism, began to withdraw. Something was wrong. Vanessa's phone calls home became shorter, less frequent, and her once radiant smile had dimmed. The shift was subtle at first, but those closest to her, especially her mother Gloria, noticed the change immediately. What was happening to their beloved Vanessa? Eventually, the truth came out, although it wasn't the whole truth, not yet. Vanessa confided in her mother that she was being sexually harassed by a superior officer at the base, but even then, Vanessa was guarded. She didn't name him, and she certainly didn't want to report it. She told her mother enough to raise alarms, but not enough to fully explain the torment she was enduring. This man, this sergeant, wasn't just making inappropriate advances. He was stalking her, following her during her workouts, watching her. His presence was constant, looming, suffocating. Fort Hood, the place Vanessa had once been so proud to serve, was no longer a place of honor. It had become a place of fear. Gloria was horrified, pleading with Vanessa to name him, to report him. But Vanessa refused. Her reasoning was gut-wrenching. No one would believe her. Other women had come forward with similar stories, only to be ignored or worse, punished. The military had a long, ugly history of silencing women who reported harassment. Vanessa knew this all too well. She wasn't just fighting one man's unwanted attention. She was fighting a system that had failed countless women before her. She didn't trust it. How could she? Vanessa's fear was justified. Fort Hood itself had gained a reputation, whispered about in dark corners, as a place where sexual harassment and assault were rampant and ignored. Reporting it could make things worse, not better. Vanessa feared retaliation, feared being disbelieved, feared losing everything she had worked so hard for. So, she made the painful choice to stay silent, to handle it herself. But the silence came at a cost. The weight of that decision was breaking her down. Her family watched as their bright, determined daughter began to crumble under the pressure. Vanessa's laughter, the same laughter that used to fill her home, was now replaced with silence. The once strong soldier who had trained with fire in her heart was now visibly struggling. Yet, despite her family's growing concerns, Vanessa insisted she was handling it. Even in her darkest moments, Vanessa maintained a brave face. She continued to call her family, speaking to her sister Myra often. To the outside world, everything appeared normal, almost too normal. In fact, the night before Vanessa disappeared, she had spoken to Myra about buying a new car. There was no hint of danger, no sign of the storm that was about to descend. But inside, Vanessa was falling apart. She was alone in her struggle, trapped in an environment where the very act of speaking up could destroy her. Her faith in the system meant to protect her had been shattered. She was left navigating a labyrinth of fear and doubt, praying that things wouldn't escalate further. And yet, something was changing. Vanessa's family believed she was on the verge of reporting her harasser. After months of torment, it seemed she had reached her breaking point. Perhaps she was gathering the courage, or maybe she had finally decided that enough was enough. But we may never know for sure. because before Vanessa could take that step, she vanished. In the weeks before her disappearance, Vanessa's life at Fort Hood had gone from a dream to a nightmare. The base that had once filled her with pride had become a place of suffocating dread, a place where fear overshadowed everything. The institution she had dedicated herself to had failed her, and for Vanessa, it would soon cost her everything. April 22, 2020, began like any other day at Fort Hood. For Vanessa Guillen, it was supposed to be routine, a regular day on base. But by the end of that day, everything would change. She would vanish without a trace, and the search for answers would take months, leaving her family and a nation devastated. That morning, Vanessa, a private first class and small arms and artillery repairer, received an unexpected call to report to duty. It wasn't her scheduled shift, and yet she was summoned to the arms room, where military weapons are stored and maintained. The reason behind this sudden request remains one of many haunting questions. Who called her in? Why, on a day she wasn't supposed to be working, was she pulled into this particular assignment? Vanessa, always the dedicated soldier, complied without hesitation. She arrived at the arms room to begin her duties, another day of inspections, repairs, and ensuring the base's weapons were in top condition. But something about this day was different, unsettling. There was an ominous undercurrent, even if it wasn't visible just yet. Around noon, Vanessa was given a task that would take her out of the arms room, a seemingly ordinary directive. She was asked to verify serial numbers on some weapons with Specialist Aaron Robinson, another soldier at Fort Hood. Routine, mundane. At least, that's what it appeared to be. Vanessa, ever dutiful, texted Robinson to let him know she was on her way to meet him. This would be the last communication anyone would ever receive from her. When Vanessa arrived to meet Robinson, she reportedly confirmed the serial numbers of the weapons and left soon after. But something felt off. Robinson later claimed that after their brief encounter, Vanessa was supposed to head to the motor pool, a facility where military vehicles are kept. Yet, no one at the motor pool ever saw Vanessa. She had simply vanished. As the afternoon wore on, the unsettling silence grew louder. Vanessa had not returned to her post. She wasn't checking in. Her fellow soldiers started to take notice. This wasn't like her. She followed protocol. She was disciplined, reliable. Where was she? By mid-afternoon, concern had morphed into alarm. A routine accountability check revealed what everyone was beginning to fear. Vanessa Guillen was missing. But this wasn't just a missing person case. It was far more chilling than that. When investigators entered the arms room where Vanessa had been working, they found her personal belongings, her Army ID card, her wallet, and the keys to her car. Her car itself remained parked just outside. Everything she needed, everything a soldier relies on to navigate daily life on base, was abandoned. It was as if Vanessa had planned to return, but she never did. Why would she leave without these crucial items? Without her ID, she couldn't go far. Without her keys, she couldn't leave the base. Her personal effects left behind painted a disturbing picture. Vanessa hadn't left voluntarily. Something, or someone, had interrupted her day, and it wasn't hard to believe that something was terribly wrong. Despite these critical clues, there were no immediate signs of a struggle. The arms room wasn't in disarray, no obvious evidence of violence. Yet the mere fact that her belongings were left untouched was evidence enough that Vanessa hadn't simply walked away. As hours passed and Vanessa's absence stretched into the evening, her family's anxiety grew. Vanessa was known for staying in close contact with her loved ones. She texted, called, checked in regularly. So when those calls stopped, when her phone fell silent, her sister Mary's gut instinct told her something was terribly wrong. The family's worst fears were soon realized when they contacted Vanessa's co-workers and learned she hadn't been seen since that morning. As dread set in, the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division, CID, was finally notified. The realization hit. Vanessa had disappeared within one of the most secure military installations in the country. Fort Hood was supposed to be a fortress. Cameras monitored every corner, checkpoints guarded every exit. Yet somehow, Vanessa was gone, and no one had seen her leave. No camera footage, no security records. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. By that evening, Fort Hood officials were treating her disappearance as a missing person case, but the urgency one might expect was missing. Hours had been lost, and the slow response would come under scrutiny in the months to follow. As her family pleaded for answers, the official narrative from the base was disturbingly passive. There was no immediate evidence of foul play, they said, but the reality was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. Looking back on that day, we're left with an unnerving list of questions. Why was Vanessa called into work when she wasn't scheduled? What truly happened during her encounter with specialist Aaron Robinson? Why were her belongings left behind in the arms room, as though she had expected to return? And most troubling of all, how did she simply disappear from one of the most secure military bases in the country? For months, these questions hung in the air, unanswered. What began as a missing person case would soon spiral into something far more sinister. April 22, 2020, was the day Vanessa Guillen disappeared. But it was also the day that exposed the dark underbelly of Fort Hood, a place that had failed to protect one of its own. Frustrated with the military's slow response, Myra Guillen decided to take matters into her own hands. Late that night, Myra and Vanessa's fiancé, Juan Cruz, made the 3-hour drive from Houston to Fort Hood. Arriving in the dead of night at 3 a.m., they hoped for answers, for action, anything that might give them a clue to Vanessa's whereabouts. Instead, what they encountered was more stonewalling. Upon their arrival, Myra was told that Vanessa's unit commander, the person responsible for overseeing her, was asleep. As if the disappearance of a soldier wasn't reason enough to rouse him from bed. Myra was told to return in the morning, a dismissive response that only heightened her fears. Her sister was missing, and it seemed like no one at Fort Hood was taking it seriously. Myra and Juan returned the next morning, but their concerns were once again brushed aside. The military continued to assure them that they had conducted searches, retraced Vanessa's steps, and spoken with people who had seen her that day, but the investigation lacked urgency. They insisted that Vanessa had likely left on her own, an explanation that rang hollow, especially given the evidence that pointed in the opposite direction. Her belongings, her car, her silence, it all told a story of something far more sinister. As the hours stretched into days, the family's frustration boiled over. The military's insistence on treating Vanessa's case as routine became increasingly untenable, especially as more details emerged. Key areas of the base hadn't been properly searched. The arms room, where Vanessa's belongings were found, wasn't locked down or investigated with the rigor it deserved. And then there was the troubling fact that some of the witnesses who had initially claimed to have seen Vanessa later recanted their statements or were found to have given inaccurate information. All of this, the slow response, the incomplete searches, the conflicting reports, led Vanessa's family to one painful conclusion: the military wasn't doing enough. Myra, driven by her sisterly instinct and a growing sense of anger, took her fight public. She refused to let Vanessa become another unsolved mystery. Harnessing the power of social media, she started posting relentlessly, using hashtags like #FindVanessaGuillen to raise awareness. Her campaign began to catch fire, drawing attention from across the country as people demanded answers. As Myra's public campaign grew, so did the pressure on Fort Hood. Celebrities, politicians, and everyday citizens joined the call for action, but by then, the damage had already been done. Fort Hood's initial reluctance, their deflection, and their lack of transparency had deeply shaken the trust not only of Vanessa's family but also of the public. The military's credibility was now on the line. This wasn't just about finding Vanessa anymore, it was about uncovering the truth. Why had the military been so quick to downplay her disappearance? Why had they relied on the AWOL narrative despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary? And why had it taken so long for the investigation to gain any real momentum? Behind all of this was a darker question. Was this negligence, or was something being covered up? As public suspicion grew, so did the scrutiny of Fort Hood itself, a base with a troubling history of mishandling cases of sexual harassment, abuse, and violence, particularly against women and minorities. The investigation into Vanessa's disappearance was no longer just about one soldier. It was becoming a mirror held up to the entire institution, reflecting deeper, systemic failures. The military was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how it handled cases like Vanessa's, and how many others had been lost in the shadows. And for Vanessa's family, especially Myra, it became a relentless fight for justice. Their voices would not be silenced, and the truth, no matter how painful, had to come to light. To fully understand the tragedy of Vanessa Guillen's death, we must first examine the environment in which it occurred. Fort Hood, the massive military base where Vanessa was stationed, has long been shrouded in controversy. It wasn't just the site of one horrific crime, it was a place where violence, misconduct, and a deeply toxic culture had festered for years. Fort Hood's reputation as one of the most problematic military installations in the United States didn't emerge overnight. It was forged through years of leadership failures, neglect, and a chilling disregard for the well-being of its soldiers. Fort Hood, sprawling across over 214,000 acres in Killeen, Texas, houses tens of thousands of soldiers at any given time. Its size is imposing, but behind the imposing walls of this vast installation lies a darker truth. For many soldiers, being stationed at Fort Hood is not an opportunity, it's a punishment. Soldiers often refer to it as a black hole, a place where good morale, mental health, and hope seem to disappear. The base has earned this reputation due to an alarming combination of sexual harassment, violent crime, and suicides. Over the years, Fort Hood's leadership repeatedly turned a blind eye to these problems, creating a toxic culture where soldiers, particularly women, were left vulnerable, unheard, and unprotected. The soldiers stationed at Fort Hood paint a grim picture of life on the base. Testimonies describe an environment rife with bullying, hazing, and harassment, an atmosphere where cries for help were often met with indifference or outright hostility. For many, it felt less like a military base and more like a prison. One female soldier chillingly remarked that, "People in jail have a better life than a lot of the soldiers here." The mental strain was palpable, and the leadership's lack of accountability only made matters worse. Perhaps the most notorious moments in Fort Hood's violent history are the two mass shootings carried out by soldiers stationed on the base within a 5-year span. These tragic events were not just isolated incidents but symptoms of a much deeper, systemic problem. In 2009, Major Nidal Hassan, a psychiatrist stationed at Fort Hood, opened fire on his fellow soldiers, killing 13 people and wounding over 30. It was the deadliest mass shooting ever on a U.S. military base. But what shocked the nation even more was what came to light afterward. Hassan's erratic behavior had been reported by several of his colleagues long before the shooting. Alarms had been raised about his growing radicalization, his disturbing views, but leadership ignored the warnings. Fort Hood's failure to act revealed dangerous cracks in its ability to monitor the mental health and well-being of its personnel, a failure that would haunt the base again just a few years later. In 2014, another mass shooting occurred at Fort Hood. This time, Army Specialist Ivan Lopez, a soldier suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and depression, opened fire, killing 4 people, including himself, and wounding 14 others. Lopez had sought help for his deteriorating mental state, but his pleas were largely dismissed. He was bullied, ridiculed by his fellow soldiers for showing vulnerability. Once again, Fort Hood had ignored the warning signs, and once again, lives were lost. These two shootings weren't just tragedies, they were the most glaring examples of how Fort Hood consistently failed to care for its soldiers. Both incidents exposed a base where mental health crises were overlooked, where troubled soldiers slipped through the cracks, and where violence seemed inevitable. But violence wasn't the only issue plaguing Fort Hood. Beneath the surface, a culture of rampant sexual harassment and misconduct had taken root, one that would become infamous with Vanessa Guillen's disappearance. Women at Fort Hood often described the base as a hostile environment, where harassment was part of daily life and reporting it could ruin your career. Perhaps the most egregious example of this toxic culture came to light in 2015, when Sergeant First Class Gregory McQueen, a high-ranking officer, was exposed for running a prostitution ring on the base. McQueen wasn't just any officer, he was responsible for Fort Hood's sexual harassment and assault response and prevention SHARP program. His very job was to protect soldiers from the crimes he ended up facilitating. McQueen preyed on financially vulnerable female soldiers, manipulating them into prostitution by exploiting their hardships and trauma. The scandal was a horrific betrayal. McQueen was eventually court-martialed and sentenced to 2 years in prison, but the damage was done. Fort Hood had once again shown itself to be a place where predators thrived, even among those sworn to protect the vulnerable. McQueen's case wasn't an isolated incident. Women at Fort Hood consistently reported high levels of harassment and assault. Many of these reports were dismissed or ignored, and in some cases, the women who spoke out were retaliated against. It was a culture of silence, one that Vanessa Guillen tragically knew all too well. Like so many before her, she faced the horrific reality that even in a place meant to serve and protect, she was unsafe. Beyond these scandals, the neglect of soldiers' mental health at Fort Hood has been a constant and devastating issue. Soldiers suffering from depression, anxiety, and PTSD frequently found themselves without adequate care or support. After the 2014 mass shooting, it became clear that Fort Hood was woefully unprepared to address the mental health needs of its soldiers. The base's mental health services were underfunded and overwhelmed, and many soldiers were left to cope on their own. The consequences of this neglect were dire. Suicide rates at Fort Hood have been alarmingly high, far exceeding those at other military installations. Soldiers describe feeling trapped in a system that stigmatized mental health issues, where seeking help was seen as a sign of weakness. One soldier, speaking out anonymously, explained that if you sought behavioral health support, you're listed as a crazy person and you're treated differently. In an environment like that, it's no surprise that many chose to suffer in silence. At the heart of Fort Hood's dark legacy is a culture of impunity, where leadership repeatedly failed to take responsibility for the well-being of its soldiers. From mass shootings to sexual assault scandals, the base's leadership often responded with deflection, minimization, or outright cover-ups. Vanessa Guillen's case wasn't an anomaly. It was the tragic result of a deeply broken system. The systemic failures at Fort Hood didn't emerge overnight. They were the product of years of neglect, poor leadership, and a culture that valued silence over accountability. Vanessa's death, though horrific, was part of a much larger pattern, a pattern that allowed violence, harassment, and neglect to flourish unchecked. For Vanessa Guillen, Fort Hood was supposed to be a place of pride and service. Instead, it became the setting of her worst nightmare. And in her death, the true face of Fort Hood was exposed for the world to see. After months of anguish, relentless searching, and public outcry, a major breakthrough in Vanessa Guillen's case finally came. But the discovery of her remains revealed a horrifying reality: the brutal details of her murder and the unimaginable lengths taken by her killer to conceal his crime. The answers that Vanessa's family had been desperately seeking would ultimately shatter their world. As pressure mounted from nationwide protests and social media campaigns, authorities at Fort Hood faced intense scrutiny over their handling of the investigation. All eyes were on them. It was becoming clear that Aaron Robinson, a 20-year-old specialist who worked closely with Vanessa, was a key figure in her disappearance. But it took weeks of mounting suspicion and delayed action before Robinson emerged as the prime suspect. Investigators began to piece together the events of April 22, 2020, the day Vanessa vanished. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from eyewitness accounts. Soldiers reported seeing Robinson struggling to carry a large, heavy box out of the arms room that day. The box, an industrial tough box commonly used to transport military equipment, would later be revealed as the container holding Vanessa's body. Witnesses described Robinson visibly straining under the weight of the box, refusing offers of help as he loaded it into his vehicle. At the time, no one could have imagined the grisly contents inside. But as investigators revisited these witness statements, the significance of that box became clear. It was the critical piece of the puzzle. Despite his insistence that he had nothing to do with Vanessa's disappearance, the walls were closing in on Robinson. Investigators obtained a crucial piece of technology, a universal forensic extraction device that allowed them to access data from his phone, even information he had tried to erase. What they found was chilling. The phone records showed Robinson had been in frequent contact with his girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar, around the time of Vanessa's disappearance. Robinson had initially claimed he was with Cecily at home, watching movies, but the GPS data told a different story. On the night of April 22nd and into the early hours of April 23rd, Robinson's phone had pinged in Belton, Texas, far from where he was supposed to be. This remote area, roughly 17 miles from Fort Hood, was where Robinson had transported Vanessa's body. The secluded spot near the Leon River was where he believed he could hide his crime. But this evidence unraveled his alibi and set the stage for a horrifying revelation. As the investigation deepened, the gruesome details of Vanessa's murder began to emerge. On the day of her disappearance, Vanessa had been called into the arms room at Fort Hood. She was there to verify serial numbers on equipment with Aaron Robinson, unaware of the deadly danger lurking ahead. Once alone with her, Robinson attacked, bludgeoning Vanessa to death with a hammer. The brutality of the attack was devastating. Vanessa never stood a chance. The blows to her head were so severe that she died almost instantly. After killing her, Robinson stuffed Vanessa's body into the tough box that he had been seen carrying by fellow soldiers. With her body concealed, he left the base undetected, taking advantage of the fact that many of Fort Hood's security systems, including surveillance cameras, were either faulty or not functioning that day. But Robinson didn't act alone. After committing the murder, he contacted his girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar, and enlisted her in his sinister plan to dispose of Vanessa's body. Aguilar, who had been dating Robinson for only a few months, agreed to help cover up the murder. Investigators uncovered text messages and phone calls between the two, detailing their chilling plans to erase the evidence. Together, Robinson and Aguilar drove to the Leon River with Vanessa's body in the tough box. There, they attempted to destroy her remains in the most brutal way imaginable. Aguilar later confessed that they dismembered Vanessa's body using a machete or similar tool, severing her limbs in a horrific attempt to make the remains easier to conceal. They then tried to burn the body, but when the fire grew uncontrollable, they abandoned their attempt, fearing the smoke would attract attention. Desperate to hide the evidence, they buried Vanessa's remains in 3 shallow graves, but even this wasn't enough. A few days later, Robinson and Aguilar returned to the site. They unearthed Vanessa's body and attempted to destroy it further. Aguilar purchased concrete from Facebook Marketplace, which they used to encase parts of Vanessa's remains in a final, desperate effort to conceal the horrific crime. For weeks, Vanessa's family had been pleading for answers, and the public had rallied around them with protests and social media campaigns. The hashtag IAmVanessaGuillen became a powerful rallying cry for those demanding justice. It was only through this unrelenting pressure that the investigation finally picked up speed. Then, on June 30, 2020, the unthinkable happened. Human remains were discovered near the Leon River, in the area where Robinson had taken Vanessa's body. Despite being searched before, the area hadn't been thoroughly examined. What investigators found was unspeakably gruesome. Remains that had been dismembered, partially burned, and encased in concrete. A horrifying testament to the lengths Robinson and Aguilar had gone to in their attempts to cover up Vanessa's murder. DNA testing later confirmed what Vanessa's family had feared but hoped against. These were indeed her remains. The search for Vanessa had come to a heartbreaking end, and the world learned the horrific truth of what had happened to her. The discovery of Vanessa's remains devastated her family, who had held on to hope that she might still be alive. But it also ignited a firestorm of outrage across the country. Vanessa's murder and the brutal way her body was desecrated shocked the nation, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the systemic negligence that had allowed it to happen. The discovery of Vanessa's remains was a pivotal moment. The evidence could no longer be ignored, and the authorities could no longer deflect or downplay the seriousness of the situation. Vanessa's death exposed the deep rot within Fort Hood and the broader military system, a system that had failed her and countless others. It became a catalyst for a nationwide reckoning, a call for accountability in how the U.S. military handles sexual harassment, violence, and the treatment of women in its ranks. As the investigation into Vanessa Guillen's disappearance unfolded, one name began to surface alongside Aaron Robinson's, his girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar. While Robinson was clearly the central figure in Vanessa's murder, it soon became evident that Aguilar played a disturbingly active role in covering up the crime. Her involvement revealed a chilling side of betrayal, calculated brutality, and a shocking lack of remorse. Cecily Aguilar, a civilian living in Killeen, Texas, near Fort Hood, had only been romantically involved with Aaron Robinson for about 2 months at the time of Vanessa's murder. Despite this brief relationship, their bond was twisted and dark, as Aguilar's actions following Vanessa's death would soon make clear. Interestingly, Aguilar was still married to another soldier stationed at Fort Hood, although their relationship had soured. She had already moved on with Robinson, a decision that would soon entangle her in one of the most gruesome crimes in recent history. When Aaron Robinson brutally murdered Vanessa in the small arms room at Fort Hood, his first instinct wasn't to act alone. Instead, he reached out to Aguilar for help, knowing, somehow, that she would not only assist him, but also stand by him as they undertook the gruesome task of hiding the body. Without hesitation, Aguilar agreed. It was a decision that would change her life forever, and one that showed just how deeply she had become enmeshed in Robinson's twisted reality. As public pressure grew in late June 2020, investigators zeroed in on Aguilar. Phone records, GPS data, and interviews with Robinson's colleagues all pointed to her involvement. When questioned, Aguilar initially tried to cover for Robinson, claiming that they had spent the evening of April 22 together at home, watching movies. But the investigators had already gathered critical evidence that shattered her alibi. Both her and Robinson's phones had pinged near the Leon River, far from where they claimed to have been. Confronted with the mounting evidence, Aguilar cracked. She confessed, detailing the horrifying events of the night Vanessa Guillen was murdered. On April 22, Robinson had called her in a panic, telling her he had bludgeoned a female soldier to death and needed help disposing of the body. When Aguilar met Robinson, she saw Vanessa's lifeless body crammed inside a military tough box, the same heavy container that witnesses had seen Robinson struggling to carry earlier that day. Together, Aguilar and Robinson drove to a secluded area along the Leon River, where Aguilar would play an active, brutal role in what followed. In her confession, she described how they dismembered Vanessa's body using either a machete or a samurai sword. She couldn't recall which. This wasn't a crime of passion or panic, it was calculated and cold. The dismemberment, intended to make Vanessa's remains easier to hide, was one of the most disturbing details of the case. Aguilar explained how they first tried to burn Vanessa's remains, hoping to destroy the evidence, but their efforts failed. The flames grew uncontrollably high, and fearing the smoke would attract attention, they abandoned the attempt. Instead, they buried Vanessa's dismembered body in 3 shallow graves near the riverbank. But even this grotesque act didn't end their nightmarish plan. Days later, Aguilar began to worry that their makeshift burial wasn't enough. She convinced Robinson to return to the site. This time, Aguilar came prepared. She had purchased concrete and gloves through the Facebook marketplace to avoid detection. They dug up Vanessa's remains, attempted to burn them again, and when that failed, they encased the remains in concrete before reburying them. Aguilar's actions were not those of a reluctant participant. Her detailed recounting of events showed a calculated willingness to assist Robinson at every step, suggesting she wasn't just an accomplice, but someone disturbingly comfortable with the horror of their actions. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Aguilar's involvement was her behavior in the days following Vanessa's murder. While Vanessa's family was frantically searching for her, Aguilar showed no signs of guilt or remorse. In fact, her social media posts during this period painted a disturbing picture of a woman who seemed to revel in the dark, violent nature of the crime. Just 2 days after Vanessa's murder, Aguilar posted a series of unsettling images and captions on Instagram. One post featured a selfie with the caption, "The most dangerous woman of all is the one who refuses to rely on you to save her, because she was never a damsel in distress." Another post, following their second trip to the burial site, included the caption, "I loved her, the dark side of her. Any girl can play innocent, but her demons are what drove me wild. Her secrets, her pain, she masked with laughter. Her darkness made me fall for her. These posts revealed Aguilar's disturbing mentality. Rather than fear or regret, she seemed to embrace the macabre nature of what had happened. It was as if she saw herself as part of a twisted love story, a Bonnie and Clyde-like partnership with Robinson, bound together by their horrific secret. Her social media presence glorified violence and portrayed her as empowered by their crime. This was not the behavior of someone reluctantly dragged into a nightmare. Aguilar seemed to relish it. On July 2, 2020, Cecily Aguilar was arrested and charged with one count of conspiracy to tamper with evidence for her role in the dismemberment and disposal of Vanessa's body. As the investigation progressed, she would face 11 federal charges connected to her involvement in the crime. While her arrest brought some measure of closure to Vanessa's case, it left lingering questions. How much had Aguilar known about Robinson's intentions? Did she suspect his violent tendencies before the crime? Was her involvement purely as an accomplice, or did she know more? While Aguilar awaited trial, Aaron Robinson, Vanessa's killer, was under military detention. But as the investigation closed in on him, Robinson made a desperate and deadly move to escape accountability. On June 30, 2020, shortly after Aguilar's confession and the discovery of Vanessa's remains, Robinson escaped from custody. When law enforcement tracked him down, Robinson shot himself on sight, taking his own life before he could face justice for his crime. Robinson's suicide marked a bitter end to the investigation. The man responsible for Vanessa's murder had evaded a trial, leaving the Guillen family without the chance to see him held accountable in court. With his death, Robinson took many of the answers about Vanessa's murder to the grave, leaving behind a trail of devastation and unanswered questions. As for Cecily Aguilar, her role in covering up the crime became a focal point of the legal proceedings that followed. While the full extent of her involvement remains murky, her cold-blooded participation in concealing the crime painted a disturbing portrait of a woman who, rather than recoiling from horror, seemed to revel in it. Vanessa Guillen's tragic story struck a deep chord in the hearts of people across the nation, forcing the U.S. military and the public to confront deeply rooted issues around sexual harassment, abuse, and misconduct. What followed her death was more than a call for accountability. It was the beginning of a national movement that sought to challenge the systemic failures within the military. This was not just about justice for Vanessa. It was about ensuring that no other soldier would suffer the same fate. In the wake of Vanessa's murder, her family, led by her sister Myra and her mother Gloria, became the relentless force behind the fight for justice. They refused to let Vanessa's death be reduced to a forgotten tragedy or buried in bureaucratic silence. Their persistence, their grief, and their unwavering determination forced the military, the government, and the American public to reckon with the uncomfortable truth of what happened at Fort Hood. Immediately after Vanessa's remains were discovered, the Guillen family led a series of protests at Fort Hood and across the country. They weren't just demanding answers, they were demanding accountability. The rallies grew in strength, with hundreds, if not thousands, joining the Guillen family to raise their voices in outrage. These protests spread from Texas to major cities across the nation, Houston, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., as people from all walks of life joined the call for justice. At the heart of these protests were the emotional speeches of Vanessa's mother, Gloria. Speaking in her native Spanish, Gloria shared her heartbreak with the world, often tearfully recalling how the military had betrayed her family. "They didn't protect my daughter," she would say at rallies, her voice cracking with sorrow. "But we will not rest until we have justice, not just for Vanessa, but for every woman and man who is afraid to come forward." Her words, raw and filled with emotion, resonated with millions who saw their own pain reflected in Vanessa's story. Public outrage only grew as more details about the investigation came to light: delays, failures, cover-ups, and the ignored claims of sexual harassment that Vanessa had endured. The words, "Justice for Vanessa," became a rallying cry, not just for Vanessa's family, but for anyone who had ever felt silenced or overlooked by the institutions meant to protect them. Out of this anger, the hashtag IAmVanessaGuillen movement was born. Women and men across the military and beyond began to share their own stories of harassment, abuse, and systemic neglect. Survivors of sexual violence posted under the hashtag IAmVanessaGuillen, recounting their own harrowing experiences of being silenced, disbelieved, or retaliated against after reporting misconduct. It was a groundswell of voices, and Vanessa's story became the symbol of a much larger, systemic problem. The stories pouring out were heartbreaking. Thousands of service members, both active and retired, spoke out about the toxic culture within the military. A culture where women, particularly women of color, were vulnerable to abuse and had little to no recourse when they reported it. The hashtag IAmVanessaGuillen movement exposed the deep cracks in the military's approach to sexual harassment and assault, forcing the nation to confront the fact that Vanessa's case was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a much broader issue. For many, the movement became a national reckoning. Survivors who had suffered in silence were finally finding a voice. Military officials and lawmakers could no longer deny that the military's handling of sexual misconduct was broken. Thousands of stories revealed the culture of fear that had been allowed to fester. Soldiers recounted how they were ostracized, disbelieved, or punished for coming forward, while perpetrators were rarely held accountable. Vanessa's death had sparked something unstoppable. The hashtag IAmVanessaGuillen movement was not just about amplifying the voices of survivors, it was about demanding real, lasting change. The public pressure was overwhelming, and the military was forced to respond. In the months following Vanessa's death, the Army commissioned an independent review of the culture and leadership at Fort Hood. This civilian-led review was tasked with investigating not only the circumstances of Vanessa's disappearance, but the broader issues that plagued the base. The findings were damning. The review concluded that Fort Hood had a permissive environment for sexual harassment and assault. Soldiers at the base were living in fear of their superiors, fear of retribution, and fear that if they spoke out, nothing would be done. Complaints of sexual harassment were routinely ignored, dismissed, or mishandled. And the chain of command, which was supposed to protect soldiers, had failed them time and time again. Perhaps one of the most shocking revelations was the failure of Fort Hood's Sexual Harassment/Assault Response and Prevention (SHARP) program, which had been rendered ineffective by a culture of mistrust and neglect. Soldiers did not feel safe reporting harassment because they believed, with good reason, that it would lead to retaliation or career sabotage. This toxic environment had allowed sexual predators to operate unchecked, while victims were left isolated and silenced. As a direct result of the review's findings, 14 senior officials at Fort Hood were fired or suspended, including Major General Scott Eflant, who had been in charge at the time of Vanessa's disappearance. It was one of the most significant disciplinary actions taken by the military in recent history, a clear message that the military could no longer turn a blind eye to the systemic failures at Fort Hood. But while the firings were a step toward accountability, many argued it wasn't enough. The deep-rooted issues that had allowed Vanessa's murder and the suffering of countless others went far beyond the actions of a few officers. The Guillen family made it clear that their fight for justice wasn't over. Their ultimate goal was to ensure that no soldier would ever again experience what Vanessa had gone through. To that end, they championed the passage of the IAmVanessaGuillen bill, a legislative effort aimed at overhauling the military's process for handling reports of sexual harassment and assault. The bill proposed a monumental change in how the military handles these cases, creating an independent third-party body, separate from the chain of command, to investigate claims of sexual misconduct. The current system, where victims are often forced to report misconduct to the very superiors who may be part of the problem, had proven to be woefully inadequate. Myra and Gloria Guillen tirelessly lobbied lawmakers, gave speeches, and participated in press conferences to push for the bill's passage. They made it clear that this fight wasn't just for Vanessa, it was for every soldier who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. Vanessa's death cannot be in vain, Myra said at one rally. This bill is for every service member who feels like they are not being heard. The IAmVanessaGuillen bill, if passed, would transform the military justice system, ensuring that victims could report sexual harassment and assault without fear of retaliation. It would be a fitting legacy for Vanessa, a symbol of hope and protection for generations of soldiers to come. Vanessa Guillen's death was a tragedy that exposed the worst failures of military leadership and culture. But out of this darkness, a movement for justice and reform was born. The Guillen family's tireless efforts, the protests, the hashtag IAmVanessaGuillen movement, and the push for legislative change have ensured that Vanessa's story will never be forgotten. Her legacy now stands as a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of collective voices demanding change. And through the ongoing fight for justice, Vanessa Guillen will continue to inspire a generation of service members to speak out, be heard, and demand the respect they deserve. As we dig deeper into the details of Vanessa Guillen's tragic death, it becomes clear that there are still many unanswered questions and troubling inconsistencies. While the official investigation has shed some light on the events leading up to her murder, many, including Vanessa's own family, believe that not everything has come to light. In fact, some suspect that the military may have intentionally covered up key elements of the case in an effort to protect Fort Hood's already tarnished reputation. One of the most glaring issues is how Aaron Robinson, Vanessa's alleged killer, was able to murder her inside a high-security military facility without being detected. Fort Hood is one of the largest military bases in the United States, with extensive security systems, cameras, and personnel monitoring activity at all times. How could someone commit such a brutal act, bludgeoning a fellow soldier to death with a hammer, and not trigger alarms or raise suspicions immediately? Robinson was able to move Vanessa's body off base, loading her into a large, heavy, tough box, which witnesses said he struggled to carry. Yet, despite multiple searches and the presence of cameras across the base, no one intervened or flagged anything unusual in real time. How could such a violent and public act go unnoticed for so long? And why was the arms room where Vanessa was murdered reportedly cleaned so thoroughly that no evidence was found, even after the area was searched multiple times? The arms room where Vanessa was last seen should have been tightly secured, given the sensitive nature of the equipment stored there. Military protocols exist to monitor the movement of soldiers and equipment, especially in areas dealing with weaponry. How did Robinson manage to kill Vanessa, clean the scene, and move her body off base without raising any alarms? These questions cast a dark shadow over the investigation and continue to fuel speculation about what truly happened that day. Further complicating the investigation are the false witness statements that surfaced early on. Several individuals claimed to have seen Vanessa leaving the arms room after her disappearance, suggesting that she had been heading toward the motor pool. These false statements misled investigators, causing them to focus on irrelevant areas of the base. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that none of these witnesses had actually seen Vanessa, and they were unable to provide consistent details about her movements or appearance. Why would these witnesses lie or provide inaccurate testimony in such a high-stakes case? Were they genuinely mistaken, or was there pressure, perhaps even incentive, for them to give false information? The existence of these misleading statements raises serious concerns about how the investigation was handled. Why weren't these individuals thoroughly questioned earlier, and why did it take weeks for their false claims to be exposed? These missteps not only wasted valuable time but also raised the possibility that misinformation was used to deliberately obstruct the investigation. Beyond the inconsistencies and false leads, an even more unsettling question remains: was there a deliberate cover-up by military leadership to protect Fort Hood's reputation? Fort Hood has long been criticized for its handling of sexual harassment and violence against soldiers, particularly women. Vanessa's case, with its clear links to sexual harassment, threatened to further damage the base's already fragile image. Some believe that Fort Hood leadership, aware of the potential fallout, may have tried to minimize or obscure key details of the case to avoid a public relations disaster. The base was already under scrutiny, not just for Vanessa's disappearance, but for a string of other deaths and disappearances, including that of Gregory Morales, whose remains were found during the search for Vanessa. Given this context, it's possible that base officials were motivated to conceal the full scope of what happened to prevent exposing even deeper systemic failures. Admitting that Vanessa's murder might have been preventable would only have fueled the growing criticism of Fort Hood's leadership and security protocols. Adding to the uncertainty are allegations that Aaron Robinson didn't act alone. Some have speculated that others on the base may have helped him cover up the crime or, at the very least, turned a blind eye to his actions. While no concrete evidence has emerged to support these claims, the idea that Robinson may not have acted alone continues to linger. For Vanessa's family and many of her supporters, the possibility of complicity or negligence remains a very real concern. Vanessa's mother, Gloria Guillen, has been one of the most outspoken critics of the official investigation. From the start, she has expressed deep doubts that her daughter's death was the result of a single individual acting alone. She suspects that more people, possibly within Fort Hood's chain of command, were involved in either the crime itself or its subsequent cover-up. Gloria's instincts have been sharpened by her personal grief and the troubling gaps in the investigation's timeline. Perhaps most disturbingly, Gloria has raised questions about the death of Aaron Robinson himself. According to the official account, Robinson died by suicide when law enforcement closed in on him. But Gloria believes that Robinson may have been silenced to prevent him from implicating others involved in the crime. She has pointed to inconsistencies in the accounts of his death, including conflicting witness reports about whether or not Robinson was armed when confronted by authorities. For Gloria, Vanessa's murder and the investigation that followed are part of a larger pattern of neglect, secrecy, and mistreatment by the military, particularly when it comes to the safety and well-being of female soldiers. She has consistently called for a full, independent investigation into Fort Hood's handling of Vanessa's case and the broader issue of sexual harassment and abuse that has plagued the military for years. While the official investigation may have concluded with Robinson's death and Cecily Aguilar's indictment, many questions remain unanswered. For Vanessa's family and those fighting for justice, the investigation feels incomplete. Was there more to the story than what has been revealed? Did systemic problems at Fort Hood contribute to Vanessa's death, and could it have been prevented? Did others at Fort Hood know more than they have admitted? And if so, why has the truth been so difficult to uncover? These lingering doubts leave a deep sense of unease. Vanessa's case has exposed significant flaws in the military's culture of silence, where systemic issues such as sexual harassment and negligence are often hidden or ignored. Many believe that this culture allowed Vanessa's murder to happen, and while the fight for justice continues, one thing is certain: the full truth has yet to be revealed. The Guillen family, led by Gloria, continues to demand accountability, not just for Vanessa, but for all soldiers who have suffered in silence. Their ongoing efforts to pass the IAmVanessaGuillen Act aim to fundamentally change how the military handles sexual harassment and violence. The act would establish a third-party system for reporting and investigating such incidents, ensuring that future victims are not forced to rely on the same flawed structures that failed Vanessa. The unanswered questions surrounding Vanessa's death serve as a stark reminder that, despite some answers, much remains unresolved. The possibility of a cover-up, the potential involvement of others, and the military's apparent attempts to protect its own reputation leave the public questioning whether true justice has been served. Vanessa Guillen's case has illuminated the deep-rooted problems within the military. While her family continues to push for systemic change, their fight is far from over. The lingering doubts surrounding what really happened to Vanessa and the potential cover-up serve as powerful reminders that justice for Vanessa remains incomplete, and the truth must still be uncovered. As we conclude our discussion on the tragic case of Vanessa Guillen, it's vital to reflect on the broader implications of her story. Vanessa's death didn't just shock the nation, it exposed deep, systemic flaws within the U.S. military. Her murder, and the events leading up to it, forced the country to confront serious issues regarding sexual harassment, accountability, and the treatment of soldiers, particularly women and women of color, within military ranks. Vanessa's story is not an isolated tragedy, it is a window into the systemic problems that many soldiers have endured, often suffering in silence. Vanessa Guillen was a young, ambitious, and patriotic soldier who joined the military with hopes of serving her country and building a brighter future. Like many others, she believed in the ideals of honor, duty, and protection that the military promised. But her dreams were tragically cut short, not by the dangers of combat or foreign enemies, but by violence within the very institution that was supposed to protect her. Before her death, Vanessa had confided in her family that she was being sexually harassed on base. She didn't feel safe reporting it, fearing retaliation or that her complaints would go unheard. Her fears were not unfounded. Fort Hood, where she was stationed, had a long-standing reputation for mishandling reports of sexual harassment and abuse, fostering an environment where victims were often met with indifference or hostility. Vanessa was one of many soldiers who felt trapped in this toxic culture, unable to seek justice. When Vanessa disappeared, it was her family, especially her mother Gloria and sister Myra, who refused to accept silence. They pushed relentlessly for answers, even when the military seemed unwilling to act. Their public outcry, amplified by supporters across the nation, sparked the momentum needed to move the investigation forward. For months, however, the military failed to respond with the urgency her case deserved, losing crucial time that might have changed the course of the investigation. The delays, missteps, and false leads underscored a much larger issue, a military system that too often fails to protect its own. The official investigation ultimately concluded that Vanessa was murdered by Aaron Robinson, a fellow soldier, who, with the help of his girlfriend Cecily Aguilar, attempted to hide the crime. But even with this conclusion, many, including Vanessa's family, believe there is more to the story, more individuals who may have known about the harassment or the murder and failed to act, and a deeper culture of neglect at Fort Hood that enabled this tragedy to occur. Vanessa's case exposed the glaring failures of Fort Hood's leadership and the broader military's inability to address sexual misconduct and violence within its ranks. It sparked a national conversation about the safety of soldiers, particularly women, and the accountability of those in power. Out of this tragedy, a movement was born. The hashtag IAmVanessaGuillen movement gave a voice to countless survivors of military sexual harassment and assault, many of whom had long felt silenced and abandoned by the institutions that were supposed to support them. In response to public pressure, the IAmVanessaGuillen Act was introduced. This legislation passed, created independent channels for reporting sexual harassment and assault, ensuring that soldiers are not forced to report these incidents to their direct superiors, who are often part of the problem. The act represents a significant shift in how the military handles these cases, moving away from a culture that too often protects perpetrators and punishes victims. Vanessa Guillen's death was a heartbreaking reminder of the dangers that soldiers, particularly women, face, not only in combat but within their own ranks. But her legacy has sparked a call for change that cannot be ignored. The protests, the outpouring of support, and the fight for justice that her family continues to lead have ensured that Vanessa's story will not be forgotten. Her family's tireless efforts, coupled with the national outcry, have shed light on the military's deeply flawed systems, sparking reforms that could protect future soldiers. While there are still many unanswered questions and justice feels incomplete, one thing is clear: Vanessa's story has ignited a movement for accountability and change. Her legacy will continue to inspire those fighting for a safer, more just military for generations to come. Vanessa Guillen's name is now more than just a tragic headline. It's a symbol of resilience, of justice delayed but pursued, and of the power of a collective voice demanding accountability. The fight for Vanessa's justice may not be over, but her legacy has already made an indelible mark on the world. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If you've made it to this point, drop a comment with the word "done," and we'll give you a personal shout-out to show our appreciation. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive in this murder and media frenzy. It was as fascinating for us to create as we hope it was for you to hear. If you found this episode thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We also invite you to join our YouTube channel, where you can get early access to our content, have your questions answered directly, and enjoy exclusive members-only content. We'd love to know what you think about this case. Was justice truly served? Share your opinions in the comments below. We're always eager to hear your thoughts. For those wanting to explore more on true crime, we've included Amazon affiliate links to some of the books we referenced in our researches. Purchasing through the link won't cost you anything extra, but it will support the channel and help us continue bringing you more content. If you're craving even more, consider joining our Patreon community. As a member, you'll get access to the full script of this episode, exclusive book summaries, and even the complete set of images featured in this case, available for purchase in our Patreon store. This has been 22 Crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.